everybody. So I think I came prepared because I have no slides and I'm using a handheld. So my name is Shay Banon. I'm the founder of one of the founders of Elastic, the company. I wrote Elasticsearch way back and another open source project. Thank you. Called Compass before, and I'm the CEO of Elastic, the company now. By the way, we have several people in Israel. We're a very distributed company. I'll talk a bit about that. And we're hiring. So please apply. But let me start. So what's my session about? I've been in the industry for quite some time. I've been developing software since 1999 or 1998. I became a software developer because I counted the number of jobs in the weekend newspaper, and computer science was more than anything else. So I decided to go and study computer science. So I don't fall into the camp of people that started to program when they were 9 or something like that. But I think you'll see some of the pragmatism that comes from what I talk about today shine through it. And a big part of it was I just went to study computer science because there were going to be more jobs there. And I'm going to talk a bit about bottom-up adoption, empowering developers. And by the way, when I speak about developers, even though I know this conference is called DevOps, to me, when I say developers, I mean operations people, I mean SREs, IT professionals, everybody that touches and works with code and runs applications. At Elastic, for example, we have a mailing list called DevAt. We're a very distributed company, and we have many mailing lists, like any distributed company. And DevAt is everybody that touches code. But I know that sometimes people say operations and what have you, and sometimes we try to even say that we apply to practitioners out there. Because the idea is, how do you build a company and an ecosystem that try to promote bottom-up adoption? And I'll talk a bit about that. So a bit about my history and how I went through the stages and then got to learn and experience bottom-up adoption, open source, and other aspects. I started my open source journey when I developed a library called Compass way back. I open sourced it in about 2005. I got into Compass because I was trying to build a recipe app for my wife when she was starting to be a chef in London. And I built an abstraction layer on top of another open source project called Apache Lucene. That is like an information retrieval library. And that abstraction layer, because I'm a great software developer, and the best software developers are just building abstraction layers on top of abstraction layers. And I decided to take my abstraction layer and open source it. And obviously I was pretty noob in this open source stuff, and I just put it out there. Back then there was no GitHub, so it's like SourceForge and IRC and things along those lines. And I thought that it made sense because I built something useful, and I thought it made sense for others to go ahead and use that. Wonderful things happen when I open source this project. So first of all, when I open sourced it, I thought, oh man, I'll put it in the open source and then I'll get like 10, 20, 50 developers that will come in and help me write code. And, I'll get a chance to experience a community and everybody will come in and it will be so helpful. And then what I practically realized is that it helped me feel all the time that my wife was working in restaurants in the evenings and over the weekends, because most of the work was done by myself around this open source project. So I wrote almost all the code, got a chance to answer probably almost every single question in Compass, the community forum, engage on IRC. There was a wonderful community that was forming around it. It became one of the more popular Java libraries out there. But the community was more around users obviously that use the software versus people that came in and contributed code. People that helped in the forums were much more than that, but the mere fact of it was that I was writing most of the code. And I was engaging mostly by myself with the community. And that's when I realized what the fun and the power of open source, at least to me, was. And the power was the engagement with the ecosystem and with the communities that you have. I got a chance to talk to people that were actually going and building amazing projects with Compass, with that library. Got a chance to engage with them in IRC and on mailing lists. hear about the pain points, what works, what doesn't, and try to build it and adjust it to exactly what they need. And if you think about it, and back then, by the way, I lived in London, and the only job that you can get in London back then was in the finance industry. I was using, mostly, for example, IBM tools back then. And I was really struggling because I could see those tools not doing the job that they should be doing. And I didn't get a chance to talk to the people that were developing the tools. Like if I only get a chance to talk to the person that wrote WebSphere or something like that, amazing things will happen because I'll get a chance to talk to them and tell them, hey, like this doesn't work. And then that person will listen because, even IBM has great developers. And then they'll go and develop what is needed. But there was no option for me to do it. And then I would go back home and I would get a chance as the other side, as the developer, to talk to all the users of Compass and listen to exactly their pain points and go and create a community around it of what works, what doesn't, get these people to talk to one another and help make the product better. And if you look at a very macro level on environments, societies, or ecosystems, when you get a chance to collapse people that produce something with people that consume something, when you get a chance to get them to talk to one another, magic happens. Like you create a really fast circle of innovation that has very little abstraction, right? Like as you add layers of abstraction, Compass excluded, you create layers of challenges when it comes to communities, when it comes to building what the end user, the consumer actually needs. And that's also the real power of, I think, bottom-up adoption. So when you create this ecosystem around an open source project, you get a chance to experience that, to talk to exactly the people that ends up developing your software. And bottom-up adoption is another example of that. When you get a chance to develop software that addresses, and again, no derogative aspects here, the bottom part of the pyramid of companies, right? The developers, the practitioners, the people that wake up in the morning every single day and ends up engaging with your products 90% of the time. It means that by definition, you'll build better products. And that's when magic happens. And then, to a degree, bottom-up adoption and open source kind of got collapsed together. They're slightly separate. There's still, very successful companies that don't do open source, that do bottom-up, or vice versa. But when you have these two things happening for you as a company, you get a chance to really talk to developers, to practitioners, to operations people, and you get a chance to really sometimes even change whole ecosystems in terms of how things get developed. And I give an example of the power of bottom-up adoption and the power of this open source aspect of community and developer engagement and open code and the chances that you have to really engage at this level. Back then, 2004, 2005, I don't know if people here, I'm in Israel, remember companies like Mercury and others, really developing software around monitoring, infrastructure monitoring. There was some APM with companies like Wiley and a few others. But when you looked at the ecosystem of developers and operations people, there was almost like a really rigid line between them, right? Between developers and operations. Like developers will sit there, and I sat on the developer side. Developers will sit there and write code, and then there was here's my magical piece of code, hand it over to operations people. Operations people will go and run it. And there was almost like a wall being built between these two sides. And we're in a conference that is called DevOps. And a big part of the DevOps movement is around trying to collapse that wall. I'm trying to pull my best Reaganism here. But really trying to go and break down that wall and try to get developers and operations people to work together. And we're sitting here treating it as, of course, it happened, and we're in a conference that it's called DevOps. But back then, it felt like it was almost impossible to do. And that also, by the way, created quite a bit of tension between operations people and developers. And that tension, was driven by, for example, the fact that there was that separation. Developers will write code and hand it over to operations. Operations will go back and say, hey, I can't run your piece of S code or something along those lines. It's like, I can't monitor it. I can't do something around it, blah, 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 blah. Then the developers will look back and say, yeah, you don't know how to run my beautiful piece of code. It's like amazing and it does all of these things and you're just not good enough. And that tension is, by the way, is false. Like none of it is true, basically. As long as people talk to one another, you get a chance to collapse the creator and the creator of the software, the producer, and the consumption in this case. Magic happens when you get a chance to do that. But back then, even between developers and operations, a lot of the movements of software was, first of all, not being done around open source, which helps encourage this, right? Encourage this open code, open collaboration. You go on GitHub today and you get a chance to talk to developer software. And it was not a bottom-up adoption. Even Mercury or others, it was more around top-down adoption. And if you look at top-down adoption versus bottom-up adoption, one of the things that people miss sometimes is that when top-down adoption happens, it doesn't help to go and collapse barriers. Like the masses, the people on the bottom, if you will. When you do bottom-up adoption, we are developers, we are operations people. All of us are doing these things and we know what we're running. Good things happen. Like it was pretty obvious to developers and operations people that they need to work together. But when you have software that comes and gets distributed top down, it reinforces barriers that already exist within an organization. So the DevOps movements, to me at least, what it encompassed is the rise of open source, at least in this area of developers and operations, and the rise of observability and logging and things along those lines. We'll chat in a second. But also the bottom-up adoption that happened, and we had the pleasure of playing a part in it in Elastic, and getting to a point where these barriers between developers and operations break down. And that's a big, big, big thing that happened. Now, I'll go back a bit to Elastic. Compass was open source, and it was developed, and what have you. Ended up like any good software developer, deciding that writing what in Compass 5 years after was not as good, so I decided to rewrite it completely. Ended up creating Elasticsearch in 2009, open sourced it in 2010. That part was really scary, by the way, because now I knew what open source means. When I did it in Compass, I had the benefit of lack of knowledge. But when I open sourced Elasticsearch, it was really scary because actually, when I sat down to write it, I knew that I would open source it because I knew that it's going to take all my weekends and all my nights and forums and writing code. And true to that, after 2 years, I basically wrote about 99% of the code base of Elasticsearch. And I don't know if I should be proud about it or not. And I was engaging a lot on the forums, even though people were helping, but it's like, there was like, I don't know, 1,000 or 10,000x ratio of someone that would answer a question on the forum versus people that were using the software. And that's good, by the way. That's amazing, because you want to go and foster this community. Now I got a chance to build Elasticsearch and write the code, even though I wrote most of the code back then, and knew how to build it and what to build thanks to my engagement with the community itself. And then when I wrote Elasticsearch, I really believed in the power of search. So, take any piece of data, put it into Elasticsearch, and I learned that from Compass, and then, the most natural way that you would want to go and explore it will be through the power of search. Obviously, when I open sourced Elasticsearch, the first thing that people were trying to do with it was trying to add a search box to a website or things along those lines. But then the magic of engagement happened, the magic of bottom-up adoption and open source, and there was another person that said, well, okay, maybe I'll try to put some logs into Elasticsearch. And why is that? That's because there's another company, called Splunk that I'm trying to use, and it's very expensive, and it's closed source, and I try to get them to do something, and they never listen because they send me to a support engineer and then send me to another person, and I don't get a chance to talk to the people that actually develop the software. So I write an open source software called Logstash that would end up taking logs and picking them up and shipping them to Elastic. And that was written by Jordan, by the way. And Jordan was an SRE in Google, right? Again, I could go back into my belief that developers are SREs, operations, and it doesn't really matter. And that started to really pick up steam and started to be successful. And the magic that happened was that Jordan ended up talking to, going and asking questions on IRC. IRC is it's like old people Slack. and asked a question on IRC and said, hey, like, can I do this? Can I do that? Can I put data in this format? But what happens? And actually indexing is really slow. And it's not moving as fast as I should, and blah, blah, blah. Like tons of amazing questions. And I was there on IRC trying to answer these questions as fast as possible. And then if I couldn't answer a question, I would go and try to implement it in Elasticsearch or try to convince Simon or others from the Apache Lucene community to try to make indexing faster or ideas and contribute and things along those lines. And that was an amazing experience. Like think about this movement that happens. Like someone was really trying to build like a logging infrastructure. And having challenges, they get a chance to raise questions and get a chance to talk to the person that developed the software that stores the logs and get a chance to do it better. That person, that SRE person, Jordan, was also really bad at building UI. No disrespect to this is not a bland statement about SRE people, obviously. But in that case, he was really bad at building UI. And there was another person in Phoenix called Rashid, also running operations, that was actually better in building UI. And he was using Logstash and Elasticsearch. And he said, hey, I want to build a better UI for my logging infrastructure that I'm developing. And he ended up creating Kibana. And again, like that ecosystem, that magical ecosystem started to find roots, that bottom-up adoption. And he built Kibana, and you know what happened? He went on IRC and said, hey, like I'm trying to use Elasticsearch with this API, and it's not good enough. I'm trying to plot this histogram and things along those lines, and I have a problem. I actually need you to think about time zones and what happens in different areas. By the way, I still don't know how to fix time zones. But I tried, like all of us probably. And that was amazing because we had a chance to talk, and for, a few years, there was this self-sustaining evolution of building what is right thanks to people's pains. Not like top down. I'm going to talk to the CIO. I'm going to try to get a chance to have a POC by having a wonderful deck and get them to convince to go and do a POC. And then once they do a POC, I'll have a design partner and this and that. Like actually people on the ground trying to use the software. Adoption was running through the roof when it comes to people using the software. A wonderful community forming, by the way, not of people that develop code, right? It's like, this is not about like developing the code itself or something like that. It was the community of like the innovation of the fact that people were using the software and they had a chance to go and influence it as quickly as possible and back again. That's the same thing that happens between dev and ops, right? It's like the fact that you collapse, I think developers and operations people to get a chance to get like the consumers of something and the producers of something to talk to one another. Once you remove any barriers between them and give them a chance to do that, amazing things happen. And in Elastic's case, at least, we started with logs and ended up growing, and logging and logs within, the way that you monitor infrastructure became big and big and big, at least for us as well, next to I want to add a search box to a website and make it successful. And we started to see another set of ecosystem happening in Elastic, which was fascinating to see. Like other projects, open, sometimes open source APM projects, application performance monitoring. We're trying to also put data into Elasticsearch. And a few open source projects were trying to get monitoring data and metrics data into Elasticsearch as well, and trying to use Kibana as a single pane of glass to visualize data. And that's one of the reasons why we got a chance to be at the front and center of what is called now observability. Like the fact that people are sitting there and getting stuck in the fact that, logging is a market or a set of products, and infrastructure monitoring is a set of products, and APM is a set of products, and continuous profiling with eBPF is another set of products, and those are like very, very different. We ended up looking at it, had a chance to be at the front row seat at Elastic, seeing the rise of observability and the fact that these are really just different data streams that are coming together, and all you want to do is solve people's pain point, and you don't have an observability operations people, logging operations people, an infrastructure monitoring operations person, an APM operations person, and actually developers and ops people are talking together. So the APM part, for example, is not only about the code itself, but other places. And we got a chance to see all of that thanks to the fact that we were talking to developers on the ground, trying to go and solve these challenges. And we adapted the company to try to go and address it. We joined forces with a company in Copenhagen that did APM. We invested in infrastructure monitoring. We just joined forces with a company called Optimize, for example, that does continuous profiling using eBPF, for example. And I'm happy to talk about any of these technologies afterwards in the AMA. But all of these are like massive movements that are happening within the observability space that we get a chance to go and see thanks to the fact that we're open, thanks to the fact that our adoption is bottom up. And coming here to Israel, and obviously the security market is really big at Israel, and we get a chance to start to play a big role in the security market within Elastic as well. Elasticsearch became probably one of the most popular places to store security events, something called SIEM. Either directly because people will go and build their own SIEM, like I'll go and take tons of security events and put them into Elasticsearch and visualize them in Kibana, or because Elasticsearch was the engine for several SIEM products out there. Now, we never built Elasticsearch, by the way, to be a security product. So obviously in the beginning, people will go and roll up their sleeves all the way up to their shoulders or something like that to be able to go and build a security product. But it was amazing to see because actual security professionals, security thought leaders were going and building and using Elastic to try to go and build it to address security concerns that companies have, that nations have. And we got a chance to talk to them. And then we started to get into security and develop a security product as a company, like a set of security features. And then when we started to build it within the security products and build SIEM, we got a chance to go and have a really broad view about the community that was forming around our SIEM product, around our security product. So things like open source, open and commercial endpoint security products, cloud security, all of these things we got a chance to connect to it and get the data that comes from it and trying to encourage that community. Then when we started to see it, we said, well, SIEM feels like only one part of a broader security market and security opportunity. And if you want to go and implement security, you actually probably want to also think about how do you protect your servers, your endpoints, how do you do it in a free and open, how do you encourage community, how do you encourage openness. And that's another thing that I wanted to chat to you about. The things that I'm seeing in security are very interesting because they really remind me of what is happening within the DevOps movement. So there's a lot of top-down selling and a lot of top-down movement within the security market. By the way, still today, like when you talk to companies within the security space, 95% of them, definitely in Israel, are still totally like top-down selling. We'll get 3 design partners, we'll go and have a chance to talk to 2 or 3 CISOs, we'll convince these CISOs to use our product, we'll go top-down, all of this it's a different motion. By the way, another thing in security, shifting left, which is super important, is not about bringing bottom-up adoption. Shifting lefts mean, bringing security practices up the chain of development from runtime, right, into the development phases of security. But still, most of security exists with top-down. And I think if you want to look at a market that is actually pretty disappointing as someone that doesn't come from security, as someone that doesn't come from the security market, is security. The market is extremely fragmented. There's products for every small feature out there. It's a whole market. It's not open almost at all. Like there's no open code, but not even about open code. There's very little open architecture, very little communities forming around security capabilities, very little open community around content, right? It's like, how do I secure things? How do they work? What do I do when something bad happens? How do I go and protect my company or my nation? Doesn't matter, as fast as possible. Very, very closed community that is highly segmented. And the opportunity that I think happens within the security space is to be able to bring this openness. And, and we're trying to do it like a few other companies, not a lot. Try to bring this openness, try to bring this bottom-up adoption to try to remove these fake lines that happen both within products. There's no difference between SIEM and endpoint security and cloud security. And don't believe anybody that tells you that there's really is a place for 55 acronyms within the security space. CNPM and CSPM and CWPP and what have you. It doesn't make sense. Like those are fragmentations that happen because of top-down selling And obviously, top-down selling benefits from fragmentations within market. When you bring bottom-up adoption, bottom-up opportunity within security, I think that changes. And then when you do that, magic happens. That's my perception. Then you get a chance to create an ecosystem of tools that connect together and work together. And if you bring that together with openness, you have a huge opportunity in that space. And then to tie this all up, at least, again, like based on our experience and our perspective and what we're seeing, even across security and observability, there's a huge opportunity to bring things together. So if you look today, for example, between security and the observability team, DevOps or what have you, and security, you see movements that really thrive on the friction that happens between these two markets. Ask every security company or many security companies out there and ask them how do they sell the product. And many times the selling of the product is driven by the fear that developers and operations people don't understand security. Like, here's a way for you to hack the system and circumvent developers and operations people to be able to go and, protect servers that you didn't know existed because those crazy cowboys are running around and deploying servers left and right and running applications that are not secured and things along those lines. And that's, again, like that really reminds me the old school dev and ops segmentation that happened in the middle. And I think the opportunity that you have there is to actually go and get a chance to connect these teams together, get a chance to get developers, operations, security people, practitioners working together all the time, not only in deploying products, but also building products to get a chance to change this environment. And then when you do that, you'll end up seeing that observability, logging, APM, and things along those lines, and security, SIEM, endpoint security, cloud security, and all of these aspects are actually also very, very similar together. And at the end of the day, a lot of it is about data, the ability to find something in that data, and the ability to act on it. So that, I think, is a huge opportunity that we have as a company, as an industry, when it comes to observability, DevOps, and security. I'm pretty sure my hunch is that this conference will either change its name in 5 or 6 years to either developers, because that's my personal belief that everybody are developers, but at the very least, maybe it will be DevSecOps or something like that, because that's really the arc that you want to get to a chance to have a chance to use tools, hopefully single tools, that do all of these things natively within them. And I think that the best place and almost the only place to get there, and the only way to get it, is through bottom-up adoption. And it is through an open and thriving ecosystem that encourages the people that develop software, develop these products, and have a chance to talk to the people that consume it. Okay, I'll pause here. And I'm happy, I don't know how much time I have, but I'm happy to take questions.
Hi.
Hey.
Why did you open source it, the Elastic?
It's a great question. First of all, I came from open source. So before Elasticsearch, I mentioned I did a project called Compass, which was another open source project. And a big reason why I open sourced it is that to a degree, I think open source to enterprise software is like someone sitting in their, dorm room or bedroom and creating like a consumer software that ends up becoming really successful. It's the ability to go and do something that is totally bottom up and not necessarily go and have investments and things along those lines. Write a piece of code that hopefully does good. Then if it does good and you end up engaging with the community that ends up forming around it, it's like a self-sustaining experience. I also, on a personal level, I really enjoyed that interaction. Like I really enjoyed the interactions with the community, with developers. Go back to the early days of either Compass or Elasticsearch, and you'll see the amount of code and the community interactions that happen. I believe in open code. I believe in like open collaboration. I believe in a free go-to-market, like having a chance to give people a free version of your software to get them a chance to use it. By the way, not a free version that is not really used just for development or something, like a free version that you can actually go and use all the way up to production. A way to empower practitioners, developers, operations people to take software, start to use it, and if it's good, use it and get a chance to succeed because the software itself is good, right? Like not because you managed to convince a CISO or a CIO or something on those lines. So I deeply believe in all of these aspects and ended up open sourcing it. I'll tell you that the scary part about taking Elasticsearch and actually open sourcing it was not around whether it's going to be open source or not and what have you, was actually just the amount of time that it will require from me. Because people forget, but like when you do open source, it's like weekends and nights and you have very little life because you have basically 2 jobs. And I knew that with Compass that I did before, and obviously that manifested itself the same way in Elasticsearch. And that was something that I wasn't sure that I actually had the capability and the stamina to go and do it one more time or again. And you can see that, by the way, taking root in Elastic. So when we started Elastic, people that engage with Elastic in the community, wrote client drivers, or Rashid that developed Kibana, or Jordan that developed Logstash, all of these things were done in their spare time. And probably one of the first, if not the first thing that we did at Elastic was go on IRC and look at the right-hand side and start to ask people if they want to go and join Elastic, because I know how hard it is to go and develop software in weekends and nights and try to make sure that that will be their day job.
Here, hi, my name is Doron. Could you maybe tell when is the good time to open source a project? When do you know it's time to open source it exactly? Or what are the prerequisites maybe?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the first part that you want to understand is why do you want to open source a project? That's the first part, because it's like I know of companies that go and say, oh, we tried for 2 years to do something, maybe we should open source the software and then, amazing thing will happen or something like that. By the way, not for the wrong reasons. Maybe they wrote a beautiful piece of code or a really successful, project or product or something on those lines, and maybe they struggle with the go-to-market or something on those lines. The thing that I would say around at least open source, and we can get about licensing and other aspects, which to me it's like a second or third degree derivative, like it's not the important part, is the fact that sometimes people go and open source something, but forget everything that is needed to do to build a community. So it's not like magic happens when you go and put software out there. It's like you don't suddenly go and put code out there at GitHub and obviously to you, it's the most beautiful and productive and amazing thing that needs to happen. And many times it's true, but then it's not enough. There's so much out there. There was so much out there. The community work, that's the one that matters. It's the how quickly you answer questions on IRC or Slack or, I don't know, Discord or whatever, mailing lists, the issues that people go and ask and open, and how quickly do you go and address them? And address them not in a way of, it's like not RTFM or something like that. Address them in a way that just goes and try to encourage collaboration and try to go and, take that and bring it back into the product. I think those things are important. Even then, by the way, very little amount of success, like chances of success, because it's like there's so much out there and it's really hard to break through. To a degree, sometimes it's easier to go and try to convince 2 or 3 CISOs, to try to go and use your product versus trying to do a bottom-up adoption. But then remember, there's like 5,000 companies out there that try to convince 2 or 3 CISOs as well. So, to each his own. So back to your question. If the question is, by the way, around the maturity of the code, it doesn't matter that much. Like, I open sourced Elasticsearch version 0.4, not because there was like a 0.1, 2, or 3. I just said, okay, like, I don't want to scare people with 0.1. And you can still go and download that code. It's still there. It doesn't look good, I mean, all the way up to today, people go and ping me every once in a while and say, like, did you write that piece of code? And I, like, take my eyes down and say, I did, I'm sorry, thank you for fixing it. That's basically my line now with the developers.
Hi. As the company grows, how do you prevent it from becoming the IBM WebSphere and all those layers that grow between the devs and the users?
Yeah, it's a great question. People forget, but it's a really interesting one because I think about it a lot, obviously now as a CEO of a company, and how do you try to encourage a sense of innovation and excitement and applicability to not only what you do today or in the next 2 years, but trying to build for the future. So a few things, and this is where I think I won't stand here and shout developers or something on those lines, but I think that at least with Elastic, there's like a few safety nets from my perspective, I can tell you that I rely on. The first one is we do everything in the open, almost everything. We'll still have some security aspects that we got from various acquisitions that we're working on opening them up. And that's one level of comfort that we have because I know it's not about me. It's about the person that sits there and develop, ANN in Apache Lucene and Elasticsearch, talking to the users, understanding what is needed, and then making sure that we go and develop it into the future. So those foundations that I can rely on when it comes to innovations, because I know that nobody abstracts away that communication. Like if you're using Elasticsearch, if you're using Kibana, if you're using our SIM or something on those lines, you go on GitHub and ask a question, suggest something, or if you go on a forum, you get a chance to talk to the actual people that develop the software. And like that's a level of first principle that I feel comfortable about. The other one is bottom-up adoption. So if you're a company that is built on bottom-up adoption, hopefully that also encourages the company itself to do bottom-up adoption, right? Like I sit here as a CEO of a company, obviously I'm excited about technology all the time and I try to stay current, but we try to also build a company that promotes bottom-up adoption within the company. So that's another part that is critical to us. And openness, it's like I think being an open company encourages as much as possible. Being an open company encourages innovation, and we do almost everything in the open, so it's the same thing within the company as well.
We're gonna have one last question, and then feel free to approach Shay after his talk,
sure,
ask him more questions. And as well, remember, we're going to have open spaces where you can discuss and raise any questions or topic you'd like to have. So please feel free to submit. It's on the quick list of the site.
Hi. So in last year or earlier this year, you had this change of the licensing model that you had with on the open source. Can you tell us a little bit about it? Regarding the considerations and even in general when you're considering open sourcing your project, choosing the right license or?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'll break it down into two. Like we change the license and I also get a chance to talk to companies and they say, oh, we're going to start a company. Should we open source it and under what license? We just joined forces with Optimize and Thomas, the CEO and founder, is really famous. I was nervous when I was talking to him. He's a really well-known hacker. He's very smart. So he's one of the founders of Optimize, and he told me that they decided not to open source, the amazing work that they've done with eBPF and continuous profiling because they were afraid that other companies like Amazon or what have you will take the code and use it, and they were afraid about their startup. And obviously, we joined forces with them, and that code is going to be open, hopefully, in the next few months. So we changed the license, and maybe I'll answer your second question first. I think that companies that want to go and really believe in everything that I just said, so it's like open code, collaboration, and things along those lines, the open source license that you choose doesn't matter that much. And you shouldn't try to preempt, what happened in 6 or 7 or 8 years as a company. Like those conceptually would be good problems to have. Like if you build such a successful open source project or something on those lines that a cloud provider will go and decide to take it and run it themselves or something on those lines, then, those are good problems to have. Like you created amazing piece of software that is being used by a lot of people, and hopefully you'll get a chance to go and address it in one way or another. I also don't think that open source licenses as they are defined today matter that much. It's like if you look at my beginnings in the careers, people within open source licenses, there were like camps and people hated each other to a level that they hated each other. Like GPL is horrible. You should use Apache type licenses, or Apache type licenses are horrible. You should use GPL. Apache is not open source, all of these things. So I have the pleasure of being around for 20 years to actually not be fazed that much by these discussions. I also have the pleasure of really believing that the core, like open source license itself, that's not the feature of everything that I just described. You know what I mean? It's like it's a means. It's like one license or another. You need to believe and you need to do everything that I just described, and then the open source license will come in one way or another. In our case, at least, I released Elasticsearch, released it in Apache 2 under Apache 2 license, which means that basically everybody can take and do whatever they want with it, which is perfectly fine. I could have done it with GPL. I don't even remember why I didn't do it in one way or another. Even back then, I didn't think that much about open source licenses, to be completely honest. And obviously, it was becoming very popular, and people were doing everything that they could with it. We had a more unique situation where obviously the project became so successful and so popular very quickly that we were one of the first projects that Amazon took and provided as a service. I think it was in 2005 or something like that. So for years now, we already had a cloud product back then, but they were using it. And as time passed, there's some norms that you would believe that even within the open source ecosystem or how something is being used will still be adhered to, right? So it's like the problem was not that Amazon took Elasticsearch and provided it as a service. Obviously, they're allowed to do it because there's a license. The challenges that we saw, especially as time passed, is that the market was starting to not really understand whether Elastic is the builds Elasticsearch, the company behind it, everything around it, versus Amazon. And that came through what I consider to be an intentional confusion that was driven within the market. And I'll give you one example. Amazon Elasticsearch service. Like that's, to us at least, that's an obvious trademark violation. Like you shouldn't be calling your service Amazon Elasticsearch service. Who's Elasticsearch in that case? Amazon's. And that name still holds or still held until we changed the license. That was creating a lot of confusion within the market. Unrelated to the open source license, by the way. Unrelated to taking the software and running it yourself or things along those lines. Those things you can deal with. There were other examples of this type of confusion. And it got to a point where it was just wrong. It was just like wrong. That level of confusion was not okay. It was not around like taking open source and running it. Those things you can work out and you can figure out and you can solve in different ways and the different ways to solve them. And the only way that we saw about changing that, what we considered to be abuse, was by changing the license. Like we had to go and force Amazon to go and change it. Now I have no problem, and there's no problem with like another service that we would run, Elasticsearch or the open source flavor of it. There was one before called Cloud Search. There will be one others or something on those lines. Happily always compete on innovation, and it's like, and see who has the best service, who has the best. But then when the largest cloud provider in the world also relies on intentional confusion, that's a problem. Like that's harder to go and compete. Like, how do you go and do that? Like that's more difficult. And we tried for a few years, but that was more difficult. So the only way out of it that we saw at least was changing the license. And changing the license, we changed the license to one, it's not OSI approved, so we can't call it open source or something like that. But it basically said everybody can use it, and everybody really can use it. And we see it all the time when people go and ask us and we approve it, except if you're trying to run Elasticsearch as a service directly. If you're exposing it directly to the world or Kibana, then you're not allowed to do that. And that allows us to, take Amazon out of the equation. And we actually very much expected Amazon to go and now fork the project as a result of it, change the name. But the nice thing is that good things happen as a result of it. Now there's a new name called OpenSearch out of that fork. And Amazon is changing the service name to Amazon OpenSearch Service. And that one I know how to compete with. You know, it's like it's hard to express how liberating it is that you don't have to go to customers and users and tell them, by the way, you know that we don't work with Amazon. By the way, you know that Amazon Elasticsearch Service, it's not really Elasticsearch. Like we got to a point where we would get emails saying, oh, there's a security vulnerability in the service. Like, why haven't you fixed it? And we fixed it, but it was the Amazon Elasticsearch service. And then Elasticsearch was getting bad reputation due to that. So that those things are more fundamental than, you know, open source license or something on those lines. I also get asked like whether I would have open sourced Elasticsearch before or something on those lines. And I think that question is also tricky because you know, you do things not necessarily assuming that like companies will come in and try to, you know, use, you know, less nice ways to go and try to, you know what I mean? It's like if you build a company that try to assume that everybody are bad, like that's not a company that is great to do. You know, I open source because I believed in open source and believe in the development ecosystem and everything along those lines. There came a point where there was an AWS and they did what they did. And you know, obviously we and Cloudflare and MongoDB and a few other companies are standing up to this case because, you know, the company is getting bigger. And I also think that now that we got bigger, we have an opportunity to improve the market. And this is where, again, like I'll go back 20 years ago. How many people remember Microsoft calling Linux a cancer? And it's communism and it's socialist and it's the worst thing that can happen. And everybody were going, like Microsoft was going against it. The first sponsor in Elastic, the conference, was Microsoft. And we had USBs that says Microsoft love Linux. Now, obviously, never give USBs in conferences anymore. It's a security breach. Don't do that, or don't plug it into your laptop. But amazing thing happened with Microsoft. It changed. The company changed. Now there's still .NET, you know, the last kerfuffle there and things on those lines. But the company changed. They understand the roots and what's important. And I personally, I'm romantic maybe in that sense. I think AWS can change as well. The goal is not to like dismantle AWS or something like that. I think AWS can change to work together with the community to figure out how to solve it, the same way that Microsoft did. And I think at one point you need to stand up at that level, the same way that Linux did and others, to figure this out. And that's what we're doing. That's what Cloudflare is doing. That's what MongoDB and a few others. And I think that that will benefit everybody here as a result of it. And I'll stop here. So I'm getting, yeah. Thank you very much, everybody.